Howdy, everyone. For today's Jolly Lark, I'm painting up one of the new Inquisitor models from Para Bellum's Conquest. When these models were first introduced, I was intrigued by the miniatures, but the official paint scheme didn't really click for me. It's rendered excellently, of course, but that's something that's always important to keep in mind when you're deciding how to paint a miniature. There's the official way the miniature appears in the box, and you can paint it that way if you want, but choosing a radically different paint scheme can totally change the feel of a miniature. So thanks to Para Bellum for sending me the miniatures to try. I really appreciate it. I'm going to start by going through the steps I did to paint mine. Then we can look at the two paint schemes side by side. Whichever you prefer, I think you'll see they have a pretty different feel. If you caught one of my earlier videos about making mechanical minotaurs, you know that I really like the clockwork aspect of the City States army for Conquest, and I wanted to lean into that with these. And instead of painting them up as like flesh golems, kind of biological monstrosities, I wanted to see how they'd look if I painted up all the skin of the miniatures in bronze and then painted the more sharper mechanical parts silver, giving them kind of a animated statue, clockworky sort of feel rather than the more zombie feel that they're supposed to be. So to start that off, I'm painting all the metal bits with Pro Acryl's bronze. I'm going to go over some of the bits that I want to be silver later with silver, but the bronze covers nicely, and if there's a little bit of that showing through in the cracks, that'll be just fine. The bronze is not a bad base coat for an antique-y looking silver metal. With the bronze base coat down, I'm going to grab some warm gray from Pro Acryl and a dry brush. I'm going to do a light dry brush of the robes with this warm gray. My goal here is to end up with robes that are a little more in the spooky, ring wraith, and death stalks the battlefield kind of look. So I still want to leave a lot of the black primer showing. Painting models with a good big swaths of black is a great way to get these done quickly because you can start with the black primer and that does have to work for you. Going a little heavier at the bottoms of the robes where they're touching the ground, and you'll see why in a minute. And then also on the top of the hood where the light from above would be shining down. Next, I'm going to grab some bright warm gray and mix that in with the medium gray. You can use any grays. I'm using Pro Acryl here, but you could really use anything you like, just to lighten that gray up a little bit. And you could almost leave the black robes as they are right now, but I'm just going to go in and lightly kind of hit some of the corners, edges, rips, and tears on the robe with a little bit lighter shade of gray, just to make those highlights on the robes a little bit more pronounced. Lightening the gray even further, I'm going to do kind of a quick side-to-side dry brush on the bottoms of the robes. This will give them kind of a faded, aged look. Again, kind of going for the Death's Robes sort of vibe. And then just a little bit of this brightest gray on the biggest folds. Not all over. You don't want it to look like a gray cloak, but just a little bit on the bottom of the robes, a little bit on the very tippy tops of the biggest folds. And you'll end up with something that's kind of a faded, aged, sun-lightened black. Because, obviously the maintenance crews aren't going anywhere close to these guys. And normally you want the top half, the top quarter of the model to be the brightest highlights. But in this case, because I have some weathering planned on the base of the cloak, I want the bottoms of the cloak to look a little more worn, like they've been dragging on the ground, since they're dragging on the ground. So the brightest gray highlights, and this is more of a pure bright gray, I'm going to dry brush just along the bottoms of the robes, so the robes are getting a little bit lighter, like you can see there, as they get closer to the ground. And just using a side-by-side motion with a big dry brush, that'll give you a little bit of that fabric-y sort of texture, and where it looks like it's getting more threadbare near the bottom of the robes where they're dragging on the ground. And don't neglect that top quarter of the model. A little tiny lightest light touch on the upper bits of the robes to just make those pop a little bit with this bright gray is cool, but I'm really focusing this light gray. You can see just how much lighter the bottom of that robe is there than the top. Next up, I'm going to grab a little bit of that bright gray from that's still wet on the palette and just paint his little stole, little ribbons that are hanging down from around his neck. Just paint those with the little bit of a stripe of light gray. This is preparing them to use a contrast color on those little stripes later. And I just know that the Pro Acryl gray covers pretty well. And then I'm going to grab a little bit of the darker gray if it's wet on the palette and just do a quick little darker gray near the edges so that it's lighter in the middle and gets a little darker towards the edges. And these are just the same grays that I used for the robes. If you don't feel like doing the little moment of wet blending on the stole here, you just paint the whole thing with the light gray or the medium gray, and that'd be fine too. But whenever you're preparing a surface to get contrast paints on it later, you don't have to be too delicate with the wet blending since you're going to be covering it up with another translucent color. And having that little bit of darker gray now will beef up the shadows that we get on these stoles later. While we're waiting for that gray to dry, I'm going to grab some of the new reformulated Vallejo game color chainmail. This is just a terrific color, really, really vibrant silver. And I'm going to use this just to base coat any areas of any of the parts of the model that I want to be silver. Use this just to add a little bit of visual interest to the metallic bits. I'm going to paint the claws silver, that sort of thing. You can go, do as much or as little of this as you want, but adding some silver mixed in with the bronze is just one more color. You generally don't want to have a miniature that only has two colors on it. It just kind of maybe looks a little unfinished. So adding a little bit of silver to the wrist guards there, adding silver claws, that sort of thing, just make the model a little more interesting. Okay, so with the metal bits done, I'm going to go in and add a little bit of Flesh Terror's red contrast paint to those ribbons that are hanging down from around his neck. I lost the model off screen here for a moment, but we'll get him back in just a second. So a neat trick you can do with contrast paints is to grab a lighter color, in this case the same light gray I was using earlier, and while the contrast paint is still wet, kind of just rub a little bit of it into the wet contrast paints to create a lighter highlight. And you can see here it really makes that red pop a little bit on the edges. So this is just taking a little bit of that light gray and kind of poking it into the still wet contrast paints to give the red ribbon a little bit more of a sheen, like so. This is a neat trick that works well on small areas of color. You wouldn't probably want to do something like this on a big robes. The contrast paint would dry too quickly across a larger area. But sometimes the smaller areas can be harder to blend in highlights and shadows. And this is a neat trick for getting a highlight on there pretty quickly and easily while the contrast paint is still wet. So you can see that dark gray and light gray that we had on earlier is already creating a little bit of shading and shadows. So then just taking a little bit of that gray and blending it into the wet contrast paint can boost the highlights a little bit brighter. So that the darker gray, the initial darker gray is creating more of the shadows, plus the contrast paint, obviously. And then that little, see the tip of my brush, is a teeny tiny little bit of gray paint goes a long way in creating a highlight in the wet contrast paint. And if you want, I'm just here, I'm grabbing a little bit more contrast paint out of the pot and just kind of feathering the edges a little bit to make that highlight look smoothly blended. You need to work a little bit quickly, but I'm not doing anything too fancy here. I'm just using the same brush. I'm switching back and forth. It's a variety of wet blending. I find it a little bit easier to wet blend with the contrast paints because they do have a little bit longer drying time. So you're just accentuating some of the edges of the ribbon there with a little bit more gray. I think sometimes using a light gray instead of a white can help red to stop red highlights from going pinkish. So yeah, there you go. Next up, I'm going to paint the base, and as part of painting the base, I'm also going to apply some weathering and texturing on the parts of the cloak that are hitting the ground. If you've got cloaks this long, battlefields get muddy, you're going to end up with some dirt and muck on the tips of your cloak if you build your automatons such that they're dragging their clothes through the mud, right? So first step, I'm just putting a base coat of Pro Acryl Dark Umber all over. And kind of getting around, there's a lot of open space underneath. These are kind of scarecrowy models that have a lot of space in between them. So just get some of that dark umber in and around the model. This is easy to do on the Jolly Lark painting handles. This wooden painting handles, if you've seen any of my videos before, I manufacture and sell these. You can get them, I'll put a link down in the description below. You can get them on jollylark.com to make doing edges of bases and stuff like this very easy. I've been using these wooden handles for well over a year now and still really, really like them. So once you've got a base coat down all over the base, you can then go in and grab a little bit of the same brown that you used for the base, wipe it off a little bit, and we're just kind of smoosh it around a little bit like sponge painting. I'm just using the same kind of wide brush I used to base coat the base. just kind of smushing some paint into somewhat randomly into the bottom bit of the cloak. And then you take your finger, or if you don't like using your finger, you can grab a little sponge makeup brush and just wipe that sponged on paint off the tops of the folds, like so that you're left with some of that brown kind of in the folds, but less of it on the tops. That gives a nice kind of weathered, muddy, dirty effect. And I do think the sponges have a little more control than fingers. I usually always keep some of these handy. Um, so paint stays wet for a moment. You put it on kind of lightly, but then you can kind of use the makeup sponge to just wipe it off the tops of the folds and feather it upwards a little bit, like so. So start to finish, this miniature took about 40 minutes to paint, but there wasn't one overnight drying step, and that's right here. So we're pulling out our familiar pot of Nuln oil, and we're just going to give all the metallic parts a all over reasonably thick wash of Nuln oil. This doesn't actually need to dry overnight, but it happened to be the last step I was doing before heading to bed for the day. And it does take a minute to dry. You don't want to do this step and then immediately start painting anywhere on the model, because the Nuln oil is not going everywhere. I'm not globbing it on all over the model, but I am putting some of it on all the metallic parts, and I'm using a little bit of the Nuln oil to deepen any parts of the cloak that look a little light. So you can kind of use it as a little bit of a corrective for the black cloak if you got a little bit too much gray during the dry brushing step on any parts of the cloak. Once you've got Nuln oil all over, you want to give it a good hour or so to dry, because you really don't want to move it around once it started drying. Once the Nuln oil is fully dry, I'm going to add a little highlight on all the metals. I'm using the new reformulated Game Colors, Vallejo Game Color Silver, which is about as bright a silver as I've ever used. And I'm going to use that silver just to give a little bit of a highlight to all of the edges of the steel-toned metallic areas. So I haven't found a great highlight color for the Vallejo bronze. If you have any suggestions, let me know. So what I typically tend to do is mix a little bit of the silver in with it, which works fine to create a nice, like kind of a light bronze. The Pro Acryl has a light bronze, but I feel like it doesn't quite have the sheen that I'm looking for and that the Vallejo colors do. So a little bit of silver mixed into a little bit of the Vallejo bronze, you can see on the palette down there, makes a nice light bronze that's a good highlight color for all the bronze-toned areas of metal on the miniature. Now, one of the other things I wanted to change from the official color scheme is to put a little bit more focus on the face. When the pale skin is the brightest part of the model, your eyes are kind of naturally drawn to that. So instead, I wanted to make the kind of mask that the Inquisitor is wearing a bright white so that your eyes really go towards the face of the miniature, which is not always necessary, but I think is often a good idea. And I think that a stark white mask might have a cool kind of spooky effect and be vaguely reminiscent of a skull-faced, death's head. So just putting a little bit of pure white onto the mask of the miniature here. While I've got a pointy brush and a little bit of white on the palette, this is also a good time to dot the eyes of the miniature with a little dot of white, and that'll prepare them for some nice, bright, glowing eyes that we're going to give it. So it's coming right along. I'm already pretty pleased with how this has turned out. I'm going to use a little bit of the Pro Acryl Dark Jade. Any sort of dark turquoise, dark blue-green would work here. I'm going to water it down a little bit and just use this to very gently wash over the bronze brass areas, just to give it, I don't want this to look aged. I'm not going for ancient statue in the square look, but just a little bit of tint to the greenish tint to the bronze can add a little bit of interesting color, and a little hint of the green will go well with a little hint of the red. While this is still basically kind of a ghosty black and white monochrome color scheme, a little bit of red, a little bit of green will look good with each other. You could go more, you could go harder on the patina verdigris if you wanted to, but just a little hint is all I'm going for. So to create the bright glowing eyes, I'm going to grab some of the Scale 75 fluorescent orange. This is a special effect paint that I don't use too often, but when you want it, there's really not a good substitute. This is a funny paint. It's both translucent. You can kind of see on the palette down there. So it doesn't cover anything well. This is really designed to be just used over white, but when it's put down over white, it really pops. It also comes out kind of thick straight out of the bottle, and it seems like it's designed to be put on a little bit thick at the point of the glow, and then spread out from there. So I'm going to put a little blop on the orange, on the white of the eye, and then I'm going to spread out the orange a little bit so there's just a little hint of orange on the edges around the eye socket. It's a pretty quick way to create a convincing small-scale glow effect for glowy eyes. So, and if you rub off too much of the orange on the first go, you just put another little dot to reinforce the orange on both eyes. So that's my go-to to create kind of glowy orange eyes. For the base, I'm going to grab some Pro Acryl Brown Earth texture paint. This matches the color of their dark umber paint pretty nicely, so it covers the brown that's on the base well, and will match pretty well the brown that's seeping up into the robes. So if you're going for kind of draggy, muddy robes, it's nice for the mud on the ground to be the same color. Just putting this on with a crappy, medium-sized, older brush. Make sure to change your paint water after you're using texture paints, because the little flakes in the paint, the grit in the paint that gives it the texture, you don't want that to get mixed into your paint water and then make it into the next color that you're using. So it's anytime you use textured or metallic paint, it's just a good idea to change your paint water after that. If I did one thing differently on this, I probably would have put the texture paste on at the same time I put the Nuln Oil on, because they both take a little while to dry. So once the texture paste is fully dry, you can then give it a quick dry brush. In this case, I'm using the Para Acryl Warm Brown as kind of a warm medium brown to dry brush on. And I've already done that, and now I'm just going to do a really light dry brush of the golden brown, which you can see on the palette there is kind of a lighter tan. And the dry brushing the warm brown on is easy, it's just a light dry brush on the rocks. But the warm brown, what is doing something with the model, so I wanted to show you that. And I'm just getting a little bit of that yellow-brown color onto the very bottom edges of the cloak, and that'll further help blend the cloak in with the muddy ground that is being dragged across. Once you're done with that dry brushing dries almost immediately. It's time to grab some static grass tufts, in this case from Gamer's Grass. I figured I'd grab kind of some yellow-brown and some brown ones, and just stick those on to wherever looks good to you on the base. These are nice big bases, so there's plenty of room to find spaces for even some of the larger tufts that come on the sheets. One of the things I like about the Gamer's Grass sheets is they come with a variety of sizes on each sheet of tufts. And this will be the last step. We'll call that done. Like I said, this was about 45 minutes of active time. These are played as units of 3 in Last Argument of Kings, so you do a unit of these in an evening without too much trouble. So yeah, let's take a look at the finished model here against a black backdrop. And so what we've got here is a much kind of spookier, darker, more deathy, is deathy a word, paint scheme. Same model, different paint scheme. And let's see the side-by-side here, kind of a different feel. One really has a little more of the body horror gut thing going on with the ripped flesh. My version has a little more of the mechanical automaton. So hopefully this was useful. If you like my version, you can follow along with the video, make your own. If you like the official version, that's cool too. There's no right or wrong things in miniature painting. But either way, we'll see you next time for another Jolly Lark.